Great. I think we'll get started, and I'm sure some other people will come in. But I'm quite conscious that this is a session that is standing before lunch, so we wanted to get started. You know, I'm Devin Curtis. I think one of the best things about Cambridge-Afrcia really is hearing about research in different disciplines. So I thought that first session on lung health was fascinating, and I'm sure that this second session will be equally fascinating, but we're moving towards the session's called From Marketplace to Cultural Heritage. So we're going to be talking about economy, we're going to be talking about culture, we're going to be talking about society as well as health. We have a number of speakers. Really, this session is kind of divided into three main topics. And so we'll have, hopefully, a brief moment for questions after each of those three sections of this session. So first of all, we're going to be talking about an Alberata funded project between Bronwen Everill and Eric Makombe. Eric is joining us on Zoom, so he's not here at the moment. They had an Alberata Award in 2022, and they were looking at the development of marketplaces during COVID restrictions. And as part of that, Eric visited Cambridge, and then Bronwen also went to visit Eric at the University of Zimbabwe. So I'll introduce both Eric and Bronwen. Eric Makombe is a senior lecturer in economic history in the Department of History, Heritage, and Knowledge Systems at the University of Zimbabwe. He's also a research fellow in the history department at the University of Free State in South Africa. His research interests are in urban history, human economy and livelihoods, rural-urban linkages, climate change and rural development, and he has a number of publications on these, as well as two co-edited volumes. And he'll be contributing to this session by showing a film that they made together, Bronwen. Now, Dr. Bronwen Everill is the 1973 college lecturer in history, so she's a historian at Gonville and Keys College, and she's director of the Center of African Studies, so I work with her very closely there. Her books include Not Made by Slaves, Ethical Capitalism in the Age of Abolition, and she has a forthcoming book called Afro-Economics, A History of Western Ignorance. So welcome, Bronwen.
Thanks very much, Devin. And thanks so much to Corinna and to Cambridge-Afrcia for welcoming the Center of African Studies, represented by us, to Cambridge-Afrcia Day. And thank you also to the Alberata Fund for funding the project that I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. So I'll briefly introduce the project and sort of set out some of our goals, and then I'll show the film that was recorded when I was at University of Zimbabwe in April, talking to Eric and one of the researchers from the project. So soon after the first wave of COVID-19 hit in March 2020, Zimbabwe put in place the same sort of lockdown measures adopted in many other countries. But these public health measures could not have come at a worse time for Zimbabwe's economy. The pre-existing socioeconomic conditions in the country included acute unemployment, food insecurity, and poor access to health care. So in short, ordinary Zimbabweans were facing extreme challenges. As the lockdown proceeded, the contagion spread in places where people could not afford to maintain social distancing. These realities forced the government to close down informal markets and other gathering places that included watering points such as boreholes, maize grinding mills, and bus termini. The closure of these spaces drastically impacted traders and informal transport operators' incomes, which forced them to go further underground, but also devise new ways of doing business. This situation caused the usage of the electronic commerce sector to rise steeply. Revenue in e-commerce markets have been rising steeply since 2020 and are expected to reach, in US dollars, $464.1 million in 2020 and to double by 2025. The Postal and Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe reported that total revenue generated by the postal and courier service increased by 31.7% in the third quarter of 2021. However, e-commerce as a nationwide sales strategy in Zimbabwe failed to take off due to low internet penetration. So it's only at about 52%. While the digital divide has prevented many Zimbabweans from participating on the internet, Zimbabwe has high mobile participation rate, which means that social media platforms such as WhatsApp dominate the e-commerce sector. So building on our background as historians and our historical understanding of the role of markets and African consumer behavior, the questions that we're looking at in this project are how and in what ways were urban consumer experiences and behaviors in Zimbabwe's urban areas shaped and modified by COVID-19? How did retailers and service providers respond to these new market conditions? And how did urbanity itself influence these changes? And one of the things that really came across in the sort of research part, one of the questions that became more important is to what extent has the shift to online markets influenced perceptions of the economy and development after these restrictions were lifted? So the historical context for marketplace regulation in Zimbabwe carries an imperial and settler colonial pattern. From the start of the 20th century, extensive regulations were printed in the government gazettes, specifically regarding licensing and regulating hawkers and general dealers. These included regulations requiring that any street hawkers provide their licenses on demand and prominently display their license on any cart that they might use. Which might sound reasonable, but getting a license was an ordeal because the colonial government was trying to sort of keep a cap on it. So for instance, an example of these, no license shall be granted to a hawker, nor any such license heretofore granted be renewed until the officer appointed to issue licenses shall either be furnished with or shall obtain from the native commissioner of the district in which the applicant seeks or intends to carry on the business of hawking a certificate or report as to the expediency or otherwise of either granting any hawkers licenses in such district, so some districts weren't even allowed to have hawkers, or of granting to an applicant the license or renewal he applies for. And the interesting parallel is that many of these restrictions were tied to ideas about regulating public spaces to reduce the spread of disease as part of a sort of package of ideas about disease and morality and civilization. So Dr. Makombe's recent research on regulations on marketing that accompanied the pattern of internal work commuting between urban areas and rural reserves in the mid-20th century and later 20th century shows the resiliency and ingenuity of different communities in overcoming attempts to restrict access to the marketplace in the sort of historical precedent. So we're interested in how government restrictions on marketing function in this sort of newer 21st century setting where e-commerce potentially is beyond the bounds of these kinds of traditional regulations. So our research aims to investigate how Zimbabwean consumers and retailers adopted e-commerce technologies, how retailers enabled small business operators and retailers to ride the wave of the pandemic through these e-commerce technologies, examine the impact of e-commerce on overall retail trade in Zimbabwe, examine the perception of e-commerce as a sign of development amongst consumers, so whether being able to order something through WhatsApp is perceived as like the epitome of modernity or whether it's perceived as a sort of restricted practice, and examine the perception of urbanity in relation to e-commerce. So I will play now a video that we filmed. I'm not sure. Yeah, there we go. And hopefully the sound is on as well. Oh, the sound is not on. Okay, wait, hang on. Let me go back. Not sure how to adjust the sound. Don't know. I think it's like needs to be on there. I'm not sure if oh, there we go. Okay.
Hi, it's nice to see you here at the University of Zimbabwe to talk about sort of some of the second half of what we're going to discuss. So the first half of our chat, we talked about the sort of plans for the project and the research questions that were sort of underlying the project. And now we'll talk about how the project was undertaken and some of the conclusions. We're also here with one of the student researchers, Gift, who was participating in interviewing all of the participants in one of the regions that was studied. So, Eric, could you just outline a little bit about the choice of locations and the sort of research design?
Indeed. Thank you, Bronwen. Welcome to Harare. It's good to have you here. So we had 4 research assistants, and what informed our choice of spaces to conduct our fieldwork were informed by one, limiting the movement of the students themselves. So we assigned them according to the areas in which they reside. So for instance, Gertrude resides in the eastern townships of Harare, that is in Cambridge-Afrcia. So that's where he conducted most of his interviews, whilst there are other 3 covered different parts of Harare as well. So we wanted to interview a cross-section of different parts of Harare.
So Gift, as one of the researchers who was involved in collecting these interviews, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that process. So how you went about it and who you...
Okay, sure. That's an interesting question. Yeah, this was an interesting interview, particularly research, for which we were able to get the views of the people. What they thought was, in most of the cases, the views of people are usually silent. But this particular research was interesting was to understand the life experiences of people before COVID-19 pandemic, and during the pandemic and after the pandemic. What were their prospects of the pandemic, their struggles and challenges that they encountered during the pandemic, and what were the changes that were brought in by this pandemic. So the participants were very helpful, but we can also understand that there is a certain difference and similarities throughout the experiences. Be able to pick up participants of various age groups, also be able to differentiate them with gender, so that we are able to understand what were the experiences of different people of different age groups, whether were they performed employed in the informal sector, whether they were in the formal sector. That would help us to understand why there are differences in terms of the experiences regarding the pandemic.
Yeah. And you mentioned that one of the areas that was studied was Mount Pleasant, where the university is, where we are right now. And so I was wondering if there were any sort of particular things that jumped out about the ways that consumers and the ways that retailers based at the university sort of adapted or innovated in their response to the lockdown.
Yes, indeed. We see that there's a whole economy that is built around the student body here. For instance, if we go to the taxi rank here, we find that there are a lot of traders who are either selling food or other items to students, and there's a big market for that. For food, because it tends to be cheaper than the food that is sold within the campus, and other items that students would be interested in. So when the lockdowns were effected, it meant that there was very little traffic that was coming to the university. So that particular set of traders were affected, but some were able to adapt room, delivering food to households that were unable to cook for one reason or the other. But this was now at a very low scale. So on the whole, this particular set of traders were affected by the lockdown, negatively affected by the lockdown. But whilst some of us that were at this university, we continued teaching online, but because of the strata of the student body, some could not afford to access internet data, so they could not sustain a reliable connection, or to taught via Zoom or these other channels like Teams and what have you that emerged at this time.
It's interesting that you mentioned WhatsApp, because I think one of the findings is the sort of role of WhatsApp in sort of coordinating the coordinating this sort of informal sector. So I think one of the things that you brought up is the relationship between informal financial services and the sort of informal retail.
Yeah, certainly. Well, the informal sector grew exponentially during the pandemic because the formal sector, the banking sectors were closed in the first term on which these restrictions were put in place. So the time and feasibility of accessibility of those financial sectors become limited. So that's why informal sector is to grow in terms of financial transactions. People have to do their financial transactions immediately. So some of them could not even access the central business district, in which most of the banking tails are there. Banks are present in the central business district. But certainly there's an outburst of informal sector. Of course, it was already there, but it grew in number. There was an expansion of the black market trading of the currencies that we had, the minette dollar and the Zimbabwean dollar. So you understand that it was helpful for some people, everybody, because it was very accessible and it was easy to access it, and it helped in the transactions that people needed to make in their residential areas. So we understand that even the informal sector used online to advertise some of their products that they need to sell to the public using these platforms, for instance, Facebook and WhatsApp, so forth, so that they can gain some of their clients for their products. But in the high density areas, some people were skeptical regarding online shopping because of challenges that they had in the past of fraud and so forth. So they were skeptical at the first time. But as time goes on, they realize that it is the new norm. They have to adapt to the new norm. They have no choice. They just have to perhaps try to compromise. Then they adapted it. Online shopping.
Yeah, and that takes me back to you, Eric. Is there, do you have a sort of sense of what the potential sort of policy outcomes or sort of proposals you would make coming out of this research?
Indeed. I think one thing that came out of this is the movement away from traditional business models, because many businesses were unable to cope because of this unexpected turn of events, and many were unable to then open shop whilst when the lockdowns were eventually lifted, because they relied on mostly walk-in customers. So those types of businesses were greatly affected and were never able to recover because they were greatly affected by the lockdowns. So certainly there needs to be a model that amalgamates various forms of interfacing with consumers. So that is at one level how business needs to more innovative and look within themselves and see how best they can adapt to the changing markets. And government itself also needs to have a social welfare policy in place in case of such emergencies arising in the future, in terms of supporting households that are more vulnerable than others. All of these were not in place, whilst there were pronouncements that were made through the Minister of Finance in the beginning that there would be some money that would be channeled to certain households. This was never at any level that made an impact. So there was some considerable suffering in many households because government does not have any social welfare policies that are at an appreciable level. I think there were so many policy issues that came out of the experiences that we, out of the lockdown and the COVID pandemic.
Great. Well, we look forward to reading the final version of the paper, and I hope that all the watchers at Cambridge-Afrcia today will appreciate it as well.
Great. Thank you. We have maybe time for one burning question. If somebody has something they really want to ask Bronwen, you can also be in touch with Eric by email, sir. No, so why don't, I think if people do have questions, then in the breaks, you can come to Bronwen and also email Eric. So thank you. And so we'll hold the next three panelists. Thank you so much, Bronwen.
Yeah.
So the next section is a panel discussion on restitution, collaboration, and the many futures of African collections and African textiles in Western museums. So we're going to have three speakers, and I'll introduce all three of you. You might all want to come and sit up here and then take turns speaking. So first of all, we have Dr. Abba Eyifa Dzidzienyo. Abba is a senior lecturer at the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at the University of Ghana. She undertakes research in museology, heritage management and preservation, gender issues in archaeology and ethnography. She's a curator of the Museum of Archaeology at the University of Ghana and interim executive director of the Ghana Museums and Monuments Board. So welcome. Then we also have Dr. Lorna Dillon. Lorna works in the Department of the History of Art here at the University of Cambridge. She specializes in Latin American art and textile art and is interested in this link between visual culture and history in Latin America and more broadly in the global south. So she's going to talk about her Alborada, the Cambridge-Afrcia Alborada collaboration, which broadens Lorna's research to include African textile art. Finally, we'll hear from Eva Namudoke, who's senior curator in the African Collections Futures, which is an initiative that's mapping out the African collections across the university, museums, the gardens, libraries, archives, and departments. So after her PhD here at Cambridge, Eva worked on the Commonwealth Oral History Project at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London and has had a number of different roles in academia, public health and policy research in Mauritius and Kampala. So, welcome to all of you, and first of all, we'll have Abba.
Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you to Corina. Thank you to the Cambridge-Afrcia Alborada team for bringing me here, and to my colleague Lorna and Eva. I'm grateful. So today I want to discuss or share with you the how of Ghana's cultural heritage restitution. You may have heard, or some of you may have heard, that Ghana has received some materials from the British Museum and V&A. So I've been researching from 2018. I started looking at the various cultural materials from Ghana that are in Western museums that have been illegally taken away from the country, and measures that need to be put in place for the restitution of these materials. So from then, I have been through a number of Western museums to look at the various African materials, and especially my focus is on Ghana materials, so especially Ghanaian cultural materials and the way forward. So today I continue with that discussion with you. Quickly, I would give a brief introduction that will give us a background, and then look at the demand from the Ashanti Kingdom. Then I'll look at two returns that Ghana has received recently, and then have some reflection with you. African cultural materials are dispersed in Western and American museums after colonization. And post-colonial era, we've had a number of African nations calling, requesting, formally, informally, at every occasion that they get opportunity, to request for the return of their materials. A number of times, the request doesn't go well from the Western side. They don't receive response to it, or they are denied. But we are aware through research and documentation, even from the archival records, that through colonial encounter, a number of African materials were taken away either for research purposes. We've had researchers coming to Africa in the name of research, taking cultural materials away illegally. We are not talking about the gifts and the legal ones. We are talking about the illegal ones. Through exploitation, a number of materials have been taken away. You see on the map there, I will talk about that. It's part of a recent exhibition that I co-curated with my colleagues just to come up with discussions on those restitution issues. Through plunder, punitive actions, we can talk about a number of punitive actions that took place on African continent and the lives that were lost that cannot be replaced. But materials that were taken can be brought back. So that is why the discussions on restitution and repatriation. We have pillage of various cultural materials, massacre to that extent, and then the massive looting that took place on the African continent as a result of colonialism. So looking at the map of Africa, you see a number of cultural materials taken away from the African continent, and few of them have been returned upon calls for their return. So Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, was colonized by the British in the 19th century. And then there was a British Asante War in 1874, which I'm sure a number of you may have heard or read about it. And this resulted in the looting of Asante treasures from the old palace and bombarding of the palace and the whole of Kumasi. It has been 150 years now since this Ashanti-Anglo War, and the materials that were taken away has been called for on a number of occasions, formally and informally. It is now that the Ashanti Kingdom and Ghana as a whole has received some positive messages, but we will look at how positive, the extent to which that positivity is. Again, Ghana regained independence in 1957, and from then onwards, there's been a number of demands for the restitution of materials taken away. The map up there shows you the key places or key cultural areas that the nation has called for the return of the materials. Now, Ghana has 16 regions. So the whole of the nation, we know that we had European contacts in various aspects of the country, and materials, different types of materials were taken away. From 1974, the late Asantehene Otunfo Opokuwari II was the first to formally write to the British government requesting for the return of looted Asante materials. The request was denied. In 2023, after almost 50 years, the current Asantehene Otunfo Osei Tutu II also stepped up the negotiations with the British museum leaders to the extent of also meeting the prince, as you can see there. And then promises were made. And again, it's also because the king celebrated and is still in the celebration mood, his 25th year on the throne. And as part of that, wanted to ensure that these materials were brought back. I will play his voice, so I don't want to dilute the voice so that you hear it from him himself. There's a short video in this that I'll play for you to hear. So he made a request for the return of Asante looted materials. And again, after it has taken such a long time, 150 years for the materials to be retained. This was a good news for us as a nation. It was covered up, the media picked it up, covered and discussed it at length. And BBC also reported. Then from the academic angle, the questions started coming up. How are the materials being retained? The how. So media announcements, as I've talked about, was wide enough for every Ghanaian now to start thinking and talking about restitution and asking. Again, it's revived the memory and history of Ghana and Ashanti Kingdom as a whole. As a number of the youth who were not aware of how the materials, the circumstances under which these materials were taken away, were now brought into the fore in the discussions to be educated and then to know the value and the importance of having these materials back to them. So public conversations were wide on heritage and return of heritage, which increased the public attention and yearning to see how the materials look like in the first place. In the midst of those discussions from January this year, 2024, we had the Fowler Museum from University of California coming in willingly, voluntarily, bringing back 7 items. And it was as a result of their own curatorial research on collections that they realized that these materials were looted. It was part of the looted materials from the British that had ended up in their collections. So then, after their research, they decided to bring the 7 objects back. Again, there was a whole lot of jubilation on that because this one had no condition on it. So the how willingly brought in, no condition attached to it. After realizing and acknowledging that these materials were looted from Ghana, ended up in British collections and now in Fowler Museum collections, they decided to return them. Upon the return, there was a symposium on that, had a number of people trooping into Kumasi to listen to it. A book has been written on that, celebrations upon celebrations on the return of the materials. And the idea was that the materials would be showcased upon the return of the British Museum and the V&A collections. So in March, as a curator and as a researcher on restitution, I thought of bringing in all the various researches I've done together with my colleagues. I put my colleagues together and asked them that we should do this to engage the youth especially, and especially the University of Ghana students, to know how they understand the issues that the nation was talking about. So we came up with this exhibition in March, The Return of Afro Treasures, Permanent or Temporary Stay, with the idea that the British Museum one was coming as a loan. Whilst Fowler Museum, they have not been asked on their own voluntary basis, did their curatorial research on objects, realized that these materials were looted and have returned 7 of the materials that they have found in their collection to have been looted. Fortunately for us, we had the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana, Professor Nana Banfo, and the provost there coming to the opening of the exhibition, because indeed it was a very big intervention for me to bring in not just the media aspect of it, but the exhibition aspect of it. Because we know that museum exhibition and museum education have an impact. And these materials ideally are supposed to be showcased or to be in a functional mood. But most of the time, the materials, the treasures that have been looted and are finding themselves boxed up in European museums are not being exhibited. So I thought that the exhibition of it was very important. And again, we had the media also picking it up and then talking so much about it. The yellow map there, was very critical for me because it talks about the numerous African scholars, journalists, all African voices over the years, post-independence, from all over, talking about the need for the return of their treasures. Why? Mostly the first thing is for nation building. But apart from the nation building, knowledge is power. Knowledge is key. Knowledge creates the awareness that makes you who you are. So Africans needed that knowledge, and especially the youth now who have lost touch with these materials and the memories and the stories attached to them. So it was very important that this exhibition came. Then, just after that exhibition, in April, the V&A, Victoria and Albert Museum, and the British Museum returned their promised objects. We had the curator, the African section curator of the British Museum coming to Ghana to first sort of survey. Because I spoke with her, she came to me, so we spoke, so I know what they were in there. To first sort of survey and see whether, in January, I presented how the Palace Museum was preparing for receiving returned materials. To come and see, yes, they built a new museum. They've prepared the place to receive. Is it really in place? But again, I know that behind it is the idea of how secured would the objects be in Ghana. In the first place, they were taken from the place, from Ghana. They were secured before they were taken away. So it doesn't. But again, they had a whole team coming in. Then in April, they honored the promise of bringing in the materials. So as I speak now, 32 treasures have been returned on loan. The how? On loan. Restitution on loan. Bringing the owner's material to the owner on loan. And the loan terms are 3 years loan, renewable for another term. So basically for 6 years loan, 32 objects have been returned. While there was a whole lot of discussion in the country, those who are for it and those who think that no, we shouldn't receive it at all, why should it be a loan and a whole lot? But as I said, the king, for him, his people having access to the materials and knowing what the materials look like, having contacts, direct contacts with them was key. And again, for the celebration and in memory of the 150 years Sagranti War and the celebrations attached to it was important. So they also came up with the homecoming, diversity, and commemoration. And it's going to run from 2024 to 2027, the first 3 years of the loan. So after the first 3 years, we'll see how renewal of the next 3 years will go. And then afterwards, what happens? That is the question that we have to reflect on. So as you can see pictures of that, okay. So as part of the exhibition that we did, we cataloged this.
The office of the curator, and we went downstairs into the basement, 50 feet under the ground. When we landed in the basement, the aroma of our ancestors, I mean, I'm talking about all these artifacts that has been hidden. You know, there's an aroma that, you know, came and overwhelmed me. You know, I mean, I could smell, it's almost like they say, oh, welcome, our great-great-great-grandson, you are most welcome. Spiritually, I felt the presence of our ancestors.
So it's a 3-year loan agreement with an option to extend for a further 3 years. And these agreements are not with the Ghanaian government, but with Ofosu II, the current Asantehene, who attended the coronation of King Charles last year. The Asantehene still holds an influential ceremonial role, although his kingdom is now part of Ghana's modern democracy. And so these are you can see on the screen, so many, these things were taken away 150 years ago. They're coming back, but as loans, you know, and people are just wondering, how?
Back to the palace and to the descendants of the rightful owners. As we return these objects today, it is our hope that this will not be the end of the story, but the beginning of a new relationship. Museums love to shine light on beauty. At the Fowler Museum, we will no longer have these wonderful pieces on display. We are honored by your offer to have replicas made for us so that we will, however, have the opportunity to tell our visitors a better story.
The physical and the spiritual. So everything that has a spiritual component is, of course, of very great significance to the owners. So it is for the spiritual aspects that's why people are keen to have it back.
It's good news that they are returning something, but they should return more than what they are returning. That's my feeling. You know, they should return more, because what I saw with my own naked eyes, you know, is just unbelievable. So I think that, you know, as I said, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step.
The exhibition that we are witnessing today has been through negotiations from my predecessors, where Prember the First, when he returned, requested for these our artifacts to be brought back. Prember the Second, my uncle, also brought that idea in 1948. My brother, Utumfo Pokware, also came up with this idea again, and then I come here now standing in front of you to also negotiate. Then in May, when I traveled, I brought the matter up again with the British Museum, and through that meeting, here we are with all these items being returned to us. We thank them very much. It is not the end. I know we still have so much to do, but this is the first phase of it. And the agreement is for us to keep it for 3 years and then renew it for another 3 years. Interestingly, people were arguing that, but these things are for us, so why are they loaning it to us? Unfortunately, there's a law in Britain, law of antiquity, which even doesn't allow them to move these items out of the country. But for the sake that they believed in us, and that we went in for negotiations and were able to convince them that we would display that for our people to also see it. The items that came back virtually is the soul of the people of Ashanti. We are displaying this for you to see that the items that were stolen, looted in 1874, not all of them has returned, but that what we have here still embodies the soul of Ashanti. And I believe within the period that they are being displayed here, you make an effort, everybody, to come in and visit, to see it yourselves, to believe that yes, we have this, yes, these were created by our own artisans, yes, we ask ourselves, are we able to do that in this modern day? In those days, in 1874 and early on, if we had artisans who have not been to universities being able to create this, why can't we do this now? So that is also excellent to our students, that's excellent to our young people and all that, to be able to be creative enough to be able to design these artists. So the spirit is back here, and everybody should please visit. The Bronwen sword is there, the Chimcha is there, everything up there are all being displayed for you to see that yes, as we said, when they ransacked here, yes, it was true. Yes, they are still keeping our artifact, but we also are happy that they've agreed to return some of these to us for display for our people to see it. So thank you. Let us accept that today is a day for Ashanti. It's a day for the Black African continent, that the spirit that we bore and share is back with us again today. Thank you very much.
Okay. So finally, I asked, should African materials be returned on conditions? And for Ghanaians, what happens after 6 years of now getting an encounter with their materials, when they are now learning a lot about the past, and when they are now, as the Tumfo said, artisans are going to be inspired from it? Finally, this is where collaborations are very important. And again, collaborations, when it comes to the university level, it's very easy at the university level compared to government level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ava. This is not the end. And Lorna.
So thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm going to run through the collaboration that I've had with ABBA so far. So as you heard, I'm a Latin Americanist. I specialize in Latin American textile art. Specifically, I'm working on activist embroidery made by feminist groups in Colombia, Chile, and throughout Latin America. So I've been approached by a few publishers who are interested in books that take a more global approach to textiles, and that was really what got me to start thinking about, are there any similar embroidery sewing groups in Africa that might also be working on human rights or any issues really related to the United Nations Goals for Sustainable Development. So in History of Art, I had been teaching restoration and restitution and using some of ABBA's articles in my teaching. So I reached out to her to see whether or not we might forge a collaboration. And we're really grateful to the Cambridge-Afrcia Albarada Fund and to Corinna for supporting our work to try and bring our different research interests together. So as you can see, we work on different specialities, so we tried to bring these together, initially thinking about different types of African or Ghanaian textiles in museum storage outside of Ghana. So there's been a textiles turn in recent years, and there's really a lot of interest in sewing, needlework, and textiles in general, but very little is known about African embroidery, and particularly some of the items that we have in collections here. So of course we started our work thinking about Ghanaian objects in British museums. So we went first of all to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology and reflected on the Asante items that were there. So as you've heard from Abba's talk, these items were looted, and so our conversations really began by looking at the acknowledgement of this looting by curators and thinking through some of the work that is being done by curators in the United Kingdom to acknowledge heritage and also to try and move things forward. So yeah, it was interesting for us that the looting is also acknowledged in the interpretation of the exhibitions. But I think what we also found is that looting is not the whole story, that the university collections and some of the national collections that we looked at also have items that were donated, and roughly they fall into different kinds of donations, which might be through missionary practices or through anthropological practices. And so I was particularly interested in this Asante robe because, of course, having looked at the objects, the gold objects from the Ashanti people that were looted and are so prevalent in British museums, and having seen them acknowledged as looting, whenever we think of Ashanti items, we think of them as having been looted. But actually what we found in terms of the textiles is that sometimes they were offered as gifts. So this royal robe is made from strips of woven fabric in yellow, red, blue, and black with checks and stripes, and have some embroidered sections of kente design. And the correspondence files indicate 3 letters which discuss a stool, a chair, and a robe, which were all given to the maternal grandparents of Gao. Well, in a letter from Gao explaining the situation, he said that they were given by a Reverend Trigaskis, General Superintendent of the Wesleyan missions in West Africa. And he is noted as the tutor of Prince John Oso Ansa, the material uncle of King Kofi or Kofi of Ashanti, who had been driven out of the Cape Coast castle where he was living and was afraid of an invasion. So we're only just starting to work through some of this archival material, looking at these items which were given by Tres Gasses as a gift in return for their hospitality staying with Gau's mother in 1874. So as I say, we're just starting to look at these records and think through some of these histories and how they've been presented and what they might mean. We also went to the Pitt River Museum, and the Textiles repository was in the process of being moved to a new storage facility, so we weren't able to access the textiles that weren't on display. We met with Lennon Mishi, who works at the Pitt River Museum and who's also presented in one of the modules that I convene that includes work on restitution. And I think what was really powerful for me was looking at some of the objects with Lennon and him talking about different knowledge systems. So we looked at, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it, we looked at one ceremonial dagger or sword, and Lennon explained that these items were used in Africa to pass on knowledge. So the knowledge systems weren't necessarily written knowledge, but the swords, the implement might come out once a year for a ceremony to be passed on, for example, father to son, and through that ceremony, the knowledge and the heritage of the people, and specifically family knowledge, would be passed on. So I think what became really apparent is that the looting of the objects not only took away valuable economic objects, but disrupted these knowledge systems that were being passed on through the objects. And so we had conversations as well with Lennon about work he does now with art students in London who engage with the objects. And as we weren't able to see textiles, we were able to see some of the Asante gold weights which were in storage, which the provenance records for these items state that they were collected by Major C.H.W. Donovan, a founding member of the Army Service Corps during the Ashanti War that Abba mentioned. And online records gave us, so looking at the books where these were catalogued, gave us further information about essentially these looted objects. And having conversations with different stakeholders in the UK is very interesting to also think about the pushback from stakeholders in the British gallery, not so much from curators, but really from people with an interest in art and artifacts, saying that at the time, the looting of objects was actually a way that army officers were paid. So it's not to justify, I'm not trying to justify the looting in any way, but it's also interesting for us to sort of reflect on the ways and the arguments that are made against the restitution of objects. So we also were able to speak to the museum about the work that they do in public engagement with textiles. And I think one of the things about textiles in their sort of haptic and quotidian sense is that they're a great way of engaging people. So while it's very difficult to exhibit textiles for a long period of time because of their fragility, they can also be used to engage sort of everyday textiles that can be bought readily now, can be used to engage communities with their histories. So we spoke about the textiles being used in that sense, and then we went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where they've had a couple of exhibitions of African fashion in textiles. And then Abba gave a talk in Murray Edwards on restitution, much like the talk that she gave today. And again, it was interesting to hear people in the audience, one Nigerian woman in particular, saying that she'd been in the UK for many years, but after the first year in the UK going into museums, she was no longer able to go into museums and see her own country's artifacts represented in a way that they're not present in her own country. So thinking then back to the textiles, we started to look at the provenance of some of the textiles that were donated, and I became particularly interested in donations by Esther Goody, who was an anthropologist in the University of Cambridge and donated textiles in the 80s, but I think her work was very much overlooked. Her husband was also an eminent anthropologist, and her work on crafts and her engagement with Ghana and her work with the Ghanaian government looking at education and different sort of, her work really, in a way, what we would say benefiting the country, has really been overshadowed. And so we're starting to look at her work with textiles, publishing an edited volume on textiles, and also her broader work collaborating with Ghana. And then, so this is just where we're starting with this. I'm also in Mary Edwards College. She was a fellow of Newhall, so the college is also particularly interested in the work that she did, and also finding out more about these textiles that she donated to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which actually don't have much information about them in the system, so we're in the process of trying to contact her daughter to get access to her papers to fill in those gaps. And so I'll close, I know my time is up. We also reflected on Ghanaian and African textiles today, and we went to the Tate to see the Turban Hall installation of Behind the Red Moon by Ella Natsui, which is actually made from bottle tops, but it forms a kind of fabric, and it's a monumental textile sculptural installation that reflects on colonial trade routes, the history of transatlantic commerce, and the trade in enslaved people. So we were really reflecting on sort of the full, broad trajectory of African textiles and the form that they take today. And I guess I just wanted to end, in case there's any art collectors among you, on some of the vibrant contemporary work that's been done today, such as this art work by Wendy McGuigan Belete. So I'm going to ask if you could complete a questionnaire that will be handed out amongst you if you feel like sharing your thoughts on Abba's work and on the work that Eva is going to present with her museum's collection, and also on some of my reflections today. That would be helpful for us. You can do it either on my website or on the paper that is just about to be shared. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And now finally we have Eva, who will be talking about her work with African collections in Cambridge. Now, did you have PowerPoint?
Yeah. Should you just go back? It should just be...
I think it should be back here.
Great. I think I'll give it one more minute before the questionnaire gets sent round. And yeah, if you can hold off not filling that in until I've done my presentation, because it might give you a bit of extra food for thought on that. So as I said, or as was said, I'm Eva Namudoke, and I'm working on a project at the Fitzwilliam Museum, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about today and connect it back to the presentations by our two earlier speakers. So just to let you know, this image is a picture of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the MAA, taken around 1975. So just to give you a little bit of background on African Collections Futures. So this project, as I said, is based at the Fitzwilliam Museum, but it's working across the entirety of the University of Cambridge Museums. For anybody who doesn't know, there are actually 8 museums and a botanic garden that are part of the University of Cambridge. There's also the university library, various departments, and I'm doing my research across all of those institutions. I'm basically working everywhere but the colleges. I think for Cambridge people, it'll be obvious why in the time I have allotted, I can't do this research across the colleges. But there's actually a very, very interesting and complicated story to tell about Cambridge collecting and its relationship to the various colleges. So I should also add that my research speaks to and is inspired by wider research at both the university and at the university museums that reflects on these various institutions' connections to empire and enslavement. So what I'm doing in my research is I am mapping out where African materials are across the collections. I'm looking at engagements with scholars, so including African research and heritage institutions, but also with African diaspora communities and communities of origin on the continent. And I'm working across 4 major categories, which is what I'm going to be presenting about today. And roughly they are, the first category is artifacts made by people. This is the category that people tend to be the most interested in. It's where the artifacts that both Lorna and Abba have talked about today fall under. I'm also looking at materials that are natural history collections, so your fossils, plants, minerals, things like that. The third category looks at depictions or references to Africa or African people, and essentially this is a review of the archival material, really, as well as depictions in painting, sculpture, and other medium of Africa and African people. And finally, category 4 looks at materials made with material from the continent. So, for example, pieces of art that are made with African ivory, gold, and a particular kind of leather that I'll talk about a little bit at the end. So what I'm doing with this project is I'm doing this mapping, as I said, across these categories, thinking about how we're working with our counterparts on the continent and in communities, and then I'm going to be putting all of that together in a report and making some recommendations on how we can do this work better. Now, all of that, essentially this sort of big project means that it's going to be an introduction to African collections at Cambridge. It's not possible at this stage to say there's X number of Ghanaian artifacts and they're here, and here. The collections are just too large and the documentation is too complicated to be able to say that. But the hope is that this will be a means of sort of signposting areas for future research and providing people with their own way into the collections. And all of that is going to be in a report that's going to be made available to the public. So everybody in this room, hopefully, should have a means of knowing the African material at the University of Cambridge around the end of 2024. So just for anybody who doesn't know, just these are some of the images. These are 6 of the 9 institutions. The MAA was the first slide. I think what's missing is Kettle's Yard, and another museum that I can't think of off the top of my head. But a couple of key things. One is just the diversity of the collections, and 2, that there's African material in each and every one of these museums. So it looks a little bit different. The scales are different. Most material is in the MAA, but there's also a fairly significant collection in the Fitzwilliam Museum, which I'll talk about in a second. So looking at category A, this is objects made by African people, and these images are just 3 examples across 3 different collections that give you a sense of the sort of material that we're talking about at the University of Cambridge. So this example here of this coffin is from the Fitzwilliam Museum. So the Fitzwilliam Museum has around 16,000 artifacts from ancient Egypt. And interestingly, there's all sorts of discourse around the position that ancient Egypt has separate from the rest of Africa and even as compared to contemporary Egypt. So the Fitzwilliam is sort of thought of as the kind of fine art museum. So placing ancient Egyptian material and particular kinds of ancient Egyptian material in that museum also tells us something about what the kind of curators across the history of the Fitzwilliam Museum thought of the sorts of makers of this material. On my far right, you can see a chief's hat from Nigeria. So this is one of around 3,500 objects from Nigeria that were collected by one individual. His name was Northcote Thomas, and he was the first appointed government anthropologist for Nigeria. So he was an anthropologist, but his work was actually used to essentially more efficiently govern the people of Nigeria. And again, a collection of 5,000 artifacts just from one individual is something to think about when we think about the numbers that Abba was talking about of material that's being returned. And a key thing to note there is that the sort of methods of acquisition vary widely across the collections. There's gifting, there's commissioning, there's excavation, and of course there's theft and loot. And the example in the middle is a really interesting kind of inroad into that. So this is an Ethiopian manuscript at the university library. And the kind of provenance of this is quite interesting. So this, according to the catalogue of this was purchased by a British soldier on his way back from the siege of Magdala in the 1860s. So there's actually a number of artifacts across the university that we can directly tie to Magdala, some, that we can tie a little bit looser, but that's a very well-documented case of what is essentially legal looting. So when we think about the sort of illegal extraction of material from the continent, this Magdala example is a really interesting and important one because, as Lorna was saying, essentially the kind of looting of the palace, of the fort, and then the kind of selling off of those artifacts to museums, to soldiers, was used as a way to pay for this expedition. So it was legal then, but we understand that it was immoral. So even thinking about the ways that we use terms like legal or illegal is something that we need to think about as we kind of proceed with this work. So category B is natural history specimens. And what I'm doing with this category is thinking really broadly about African labor, African expertise, and how African people and African contexts are essentially written out of museum catalogues and even museum labels sometimes. So both of these examples are examples of that. The spring hair that you can see was actually collected by a British soldier while he was stationed as administrator in a concentration camp during the Boer War in South Africa. And he collected hundreds of specimens that he gave to several museums. And I think the conditions of the particular camp that he was stationed at were among some of the worst conditions that people had to endure. But it's interesting to think about the mentality of an individual who, despite being in that context, is still kind of conducting scientific research and a museum that is benefiting from that work that's going on. This example that you can see here, this kind of sheet from a book, belongs to Ivan T. Sanderson, who is kind of the name attributed to a pretty important collection at the Zoology Museum, and that includes some specimens from Cameroon. And what's interesting about that collection is when you read kind of this travelogue that he wrote, when you read his personal papers, when you read the kind of papers that he was presenting at kind of the Royal Geographical Society, you see just how much African labor it took to collect I think it was 800 specimens that ended up being collected as part of this expedition. I mean, just to give one example, Sanderson talks about African team members, who lay on their bellies for hours and hours to collect spiders that would be put in tiny test tubes. And it's interesting that as he acknowledges this labor, he very rarely names the African individuals who are part of this. And today we kind of think of that as the Sanderson collection, not Sanderson plus his collaborators. So this category C, as I said, is sort of archival material, paintings, depictions of African people. And I think a lot about photography and kind of want to give these two examples as the kind of image we see often. So the image of the school children. These are both from the Royal Commonwealth Society's collection, by the way, which has, I think, over 3,000 African images among those that have been catalogued and are viewable online. So the image that we see on my right is pretty standard. We don't know who the people are in the image. In this case, we actually don't even know where in Africa it was taken. I think the RCS understands that this was used as sort of a teaching aid for the Church Missionary Society in their activities. And we can juxtapose that with this photograph of Sir Paulo Kagwa, who was the Katikiro, or the Prime Minister of the Buganda Kingdom, and is actually one of the very few named African individuals who donated material directly to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. So an interesting example of an elite African person who was operating in the early 1900s in a colonial system and using that for his own political gain. So the final category is kind of the most amorphous. It includes materials that don't necessarily have anything directly to do with Africa, but it's a really interesting means of thinking about African technology, trade, and expertise again. And in this slide, both of the images are examples of a type of leather that's called Morocco leather or Niger Morocco. And it's a really interesting material because there's actually very little research done on where the kind of leather originally comes from. So it's kind of acknowledged in bookbinding circles as the best material to bind books and kind of other high-end materials. It's incredibly beautiful, it's supple, it works really, really well. And but nobody really talks about where it came from. So there's actually kind of two theories. One, that it came directly from Moroccan traders, hence the name Morocco. Another, that it came from northern Nigerian communities, which is where the kind of Niger Morocco moniker comes in. And it's a really, really beautiful material that kind of comes into the UK in around kind of 1500s, but there's a lot of imitations since, so it's difficult to find out if this was the actual Niger Morocco. So just to finish on this slide, kind of bringing things right up to the present. So I just arrived back from Uganda a couple of days ago, and I joined onto the Repositioning the Uganda Museum project, which was a return of 39 artifacts from the MAA to the Uganda Museum. So a couple of key things to differentiate this from the version that Abba was talking about. First of all, this is a loan, just like the BA, the British Museum rather, and the V&A example. But this is a loan from the MAA to a national museum. It's not with any particular community. The 39 artifacts represent material from across Uganda. This example here from Buganda is one of the kind of the more charismatic objects. The second thing is that even though it's a 3-year loan and it's renewable, there's sort of an understanding that it's unlikely that these artifacts will be coming back to Cambridge, least of all because it's very, very expensive to actually get them there. It costs tens of thousands of pounds and is a very, very involved process. And the other thing to note is that these came from the Cambridge museums, which are private museums, which aren't beholden to the same laws that the British Museum is, so restitution can work a little bit more flexibly in that context. So it was really moving to see the images that Abba was sharing of the Asantehene and the people so happy to see these artifacts back. Because this is a national museum that these artifacts are going to at the moment, it's a slightly different case. And in fact, to bring it back to kind of Cambridge-Afrcia, there's already a really interesting collaborative project to kind of look at how restitution works in different contexts across the continent. And hopefully we can be producing some work about this very ongoing, very immediate project that's happening right now. So I just wanted to end there. This QR code takes you to the website for the African Collections Futures Project, where I'll be posting updates on my research. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email. I do want to kind of, use this opportunity as the last speaker and kind of really thinking about the work that I've heard the two of you talk about, to just ask how the two of you ensure that the work that you're doing remains equitable for both of you.
Thanks so much. Those are 3 fantastic presentations. Now, I realize I've been told by the organizers we can eat into lunch a little bit, so I did want to have just a little bit of time for questions. I mean, Eva started off with a question to both of you. Maybe I'll collect, if there's 1 or 2 other questions, I'll collect them, and then you can answer them together, because we are short on time. Yes, there's a question there.
Oh.
Oh no. I think I'm only going to be able to take 3.
Yeah, really great session. I really enjoyed it. It hit several nerves, but thank you for that. My first question is, are African governments, in this case Ghana and other places, are there financial penalties that are imposed for the return of artifacts stolen or looted or borrowed or commissioned in whatever form? I mean, 150 years is a long time. And I'm thinking if there is some kind of interest or financial penalty, at least even if they're loaning it, that can go into development sectors across Africa. And perhaps maybe Africa can depend less on grants coming from the global north and utilize that to support research and development. That's number 1. Any reflections on that? Secondly, stolen fabric designs. Now, the African wax that I'm wearing came from Switzerland. So now we have a whole shift in the design of African fabrics manufactured in Switzerland, exported back into Africa. This is a huge market. benefiting the global north in this case. Are there any sort of thoughts or reflections or work going to understand how also designs have been stolen and sort of replicated and sold back to Africans? And then lastly, in the area of education, what is the role? What are African governments doing to get us to understand the role of this colonialism or colonization? Anyway, I'm a scientist, I have another term. But how are we understanding it? Because the young people have no idea. I grew up in Nigeria, I did my undergrad there. Up until that point, I knew nothing about the transatlantic slavery, the colonial stuff. We were learning about Biafran War, and they're still fighting and arguing about jollof rice and so on. But the point is, are there actually any policies by the governments of Africa to integrate into the national curriculum this type of education so that the young people who have lost knowledge, loss of indigenous resources, can actually understand the history behind this? Because I'm saying this because what we understand is Africa is a poor continent. But looking at what you've presented, there's nothing like poverty that we should be talking about in the context of Africa, right? And so if we understand the history, then at least we understand that there was a history there and that we can assume ourselves and change our narrative, into promoting Africa as a more wealthy continent that has resources and opportunities. Sorry, I get a little...
Thank you. So we'll only take 2 other brief questions, and you'll have to try to remember these and each answer one. I think some people have...
Thank you all very much for your presentation. Just quickly, 2 questions for Dr. Abba.
If you could keep it to
one question.
That would be great. So
Okay.
pick which one is most urgent.
I noticed in your presentation that you frequently employed the word treasures in describing your items rather than words like items or artifacts. What do you think is the importance of use of language like this in building local interest in restitution? And then building from that, what other language changes do you think would be helpful in advancing your cause? Thank you.
Great, and then there was one here and one there. We'll take those 2. And there's one here as well.
Thank you. My name is Della. I'm from Ghana, so you can imagine my excitement meeting Professor Dzidzienyo. My question is about the restitution. If you look at the interactions we've had so far, you may agree with me that we are arguing from, or we are making the appeals from a weaker point. And so, the power is in the hands of the person who took our items to decide to return it or not. So the pain is that our kids actually need these artifacts and treasures to know our history, the proper history, not the one we are being taught in our classrooms right now. So my question is there any way we can change the negotiation rules? The UK has a rule that a law that says even if a museum wants to return these items to us, the law bans them from doing so. So it is obvious that my items have been taken. I am rather on my knees begging the looter to give me my items back. So is there a way we can change the game of negotiation? And is there a role for naming and shaming? Can that work? If we are not in a powerful position, can naming and shaming do the work for us? Thank you so much. Awesome presentations.
Thank you. And then we have one last question.
Okay, so what I want to know, if it is a fair question from the West, for instance, to ask the question, are most of the African countries ready to receive these treasures back? I ask this because of the influence of modern religions on most African countries. I've seen instances in Nigeria, for instance, where governors destroyed monuments, ancient monuments, and supplanted them with images such as that of Jesus Christ and maybe saints. And so in that case, that value some of the African countries place on these treasures, are they the right questions? Do the West, they have the right to ask those questions and the sustainabilities of those returned treasures? Thank you.
Okay, so clearly we need another hour or 2 to continue this conversation, and I know there's other questions as well. But if each of you could just say one thing, and then we'll have to carry on the conversation later.
Okay.
Who would like to start?
I can go first. I mean, all the questions are for you, Abba, so I'm just going to rattle some things off. The question about are African countries ready is such an interesting one. I think the Ugandan case is really important, because among the items that went back are items of significant spiritual significance to Ugandan people. Uganda is a country that's majority Christian, but these are sort of artifacts of traditional African religions. And the kind of short answer is that you look for the communities where these still have meaning, and those communities know how to conserve and care and understand what these artifacts are. And in the Ugandan case, we've already seen that happening just as of 4 days ago when these arrived back in country. Role of naming and shaming, yes, absolutely. There's a reason that when we think about restitution, everybody knows the Benin bronzes. And in fact, I think a lot of the work that's being done now is trying to kind of expand what we think about restitution to other examples, to Magdala, to Asante, to the examples in Uganda, for example. Use of language, I think, is so interesting. I love that you use treasure. I kind of think about the terminology that I use as well, and it is really, really important when you call something an object, when you call something an artifact, you're ascribing particular value to it. So it's really, really important to kind of think about that. Negotiating from a weaker standpoint, yes, that's absolutely the case. The kind of British law works for government museums, which is why the British Museum, where most of the stuff is, can essentially do the least. But there's also space to be petitioning private institutions like the University of Cambridge and get them to do more. And again, when we think about the role of naming and shaming, we are getting to a position where the British Museum is looking like quite a hostile institution, and that makes its own work quite difficult as well. What are African governments doing? I think it's really important to think about this on kind of a case-by-case basis and to think about what the role of an individual government is in that country. If you are a government in a state that is incredibly diverse, has lots of different, for example, kingdoms that are all kind of agitating for an increased role, increased power, then actually the return of cultural artifacts that really empowers these communities can be quite dangerous for that government. So one of the things that I think is really important is to move away from just kind of a government-to-government approach, but to think about how communities can connect directly to these artifacts. Thanks.
Thank you.
Lorna, do you want to say anything?
I think probably Abba should have the most time. I mean, I'm happy to speak, but really, I know from Maria Edwards that people were like queuing up. Yeah.
Great, okay, super. So, Abba.
Okay, I would touch briefly. First, to Eva's question, the collaboration. I think so far we've enjoyed a very respectful mutual collaboration. We do write together, applications were done together. She writes, I have to write, so corresponding very well, respect ourselves and our ideas and try to work along it to make sure that we all understand and agree on what we want to do. So the collaboration has been so far so good. Then education. I think that is one of our problems. Again, it's about where do we source the education from? Being a museum person, biased, we don't in Africa use museum in our education so much. We don't use it in our curriculum, but that is a very powerful tool in education. We spend hours upon hours in the classroom trying to imagine, trying to think, trying to absorb everything. But just enter the museum, see the objects, relate to the objects, feel the objects, have time with the object, and that is it. You get to now question things for yourself. You get to appreciate things better. So education, incorporating education into the African curriculum is one thing that Africans we need to fight for. Then another thing I will talk about is that Africans, we also need to get heritage lawyers to be able to understand these laws of the British, to be able to know where amendments needs to be brought in. But because we don't have our lawyers specializing in heritage issues, that's why somebody talked about we pulling down structures and a whole lot, yes. Because we do not have people understanding, the lawyers understanding and trying to speak to it, why this is not just, or why we shouldn't do this and do that. So I'll advocate for more heritage lawyers to be able to understand and help sustain our heritage. Memories are being lost because we are not relating to them. We used to have the oral traditions where we would sit with grandparents, occasions would give us opportunity of hearing. Now technology, I'm not saying technology is bad. Technology is good, but technology has taken over some of the things that we used to do traditionally to sustain our culture, to be able to understand and value the treasures that we are, again, treasures. She mentioned this. I'm an archaeologist by training. Using artifacts, objects, limits what we are talking about because we have human remains in there. It's good she showed the variety, the categories of materials we are talking about. In most of my publications, I use cultural materials. But then you ask yourself, is your ancestor a cultural material? So the human remain aspect of it now made me to turn my language, and now I sort of use treasures because you will treasure your, and Africans, we respect even the disease. We respect even the burial grounds of our people. So the terminologies also limited us in a number of ways because there are certain things you pick from curatorial perspective and you cannot really describe whether I should mention this as an object or I should. But then we should know that human remains are involved. Then these are treasured people we lost in the past. So that is why I use treasures. I think otherwise I'll go on and on.
If I can just say, just to end on a positive note, I think what I would like to say is, despite the problems in this area, the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, are investing in this. So there is, even within British governance, a sense that things need to move forward. And I just want also to acknowledge the important work that has been done by curators in this country to open up the histories, to make them visible. There is a problem in terms of claims being made by wealthier countries, and less resourced countries struggle, to go through the legal frameworks, as Abba said, to make the claims. But I think it's important also to acknowledge that the curators in museums here, particularly the Pitt Rivers, what struck me is that all of the records are digitalized. So although we went there and looked at the book to see which colonel had looted the Asante gold, you can actually do that now from anywhere. So I think I just want to end with sort of a ray of hope that actually in this country, I think things are shifting.
Okay, brilliant panel. Thank you to all. I'm absolutely sure that this conversation will continue, and it needs to continue. But this isn't quite the end. We still have two more speakers who are Cambridge-Afrcia scholars. So as they come up, I'll introduce both of them. We have Minette Shale, who is an early career Cameroonian researcher interested in diagnostic research and development in low resource settings. And she's currently in her second year of a PhD in biotechnology. And then we also have Ofosu Ansong, who is a medical doctor with a degree from the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. Worked as a doctor before pursuing an engineering degree in neurotechnology at Imperial College, and he's also an entrepreneur. And his PhD research focuses on fabrication, integration, and characterization of neural implants designed to treat spinal cord injuries. So, welcome. Minette, would you like?
Hi all. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I am Minette Shale, and I work with the Open Bioeconomy Lab, and we've been working on the search for an enteric fever diagnostic. So what is this disease? It's a potentially fatal multisystemic disease caused by two bacteria, Cereus typhi and paratyphi. Its transmission is mainly through contaminated water and food. Now, my first encounter with the disease was my father's stern warning that I should avoid the disease at all costs because it almost took the life of my mother. And so before I knew about these statistics, I had encountered the disease in my community, in my family, and also as a lab technician in local health centers in the country. So as you can see, over 26 million cases occur annually with over about 161,000 deaths. 80% of these occur in low and middle income countries. So the disease can be diagnosed via culture and serological methods, and also molecular techniques where these equipments are available and people with the skill sets are available. And where the disease is diagnosed, it can effectively be treated. So that is if we know the appropriate antibiotics to treat the disease. So treatment is currently minimized by the emergence of resistance. And now in low and middle income settings, we mostly would use the serological test because it's affordable. But as you can see, its efficacy is quite low. And the gold standard for the disease is the culture test, which has a really high specificity, but a very low sensitivity. There's a possibility that 50% of patients who have the disease go undetected. And molecular methods can be effective, but they also don't have enough efficacy. So what does diagnosing this disease look like in low and middle income settings? So typically a patient, perhaps with recurrent typhoid infection, would come to the hospital presenting symptoms for typhoid fever or enteric fever. Now we are recommended to prescribe a serological test. So in the facilities where I worked at, we never had the equipment or materials for a culture test. And even if we did, that would take us several days to diagnose. And in that time, we'd still have to prescribe the patient an antibiotics. What this means is patients are being prescribed antibiotics without certainty of the disease or if the bacteria is susceptible to that antibiotics. And what happens in the long run is resistance is promoted. And with the serological test, once you have typhoid or once you have enteric fever, you come up positive all the time because you keep on expressing the antibodies produced against the disease. And so results could be a false positive or resistance. And the only way that we can know is to perform a culture test, but we don't have the materials or the patient does not have the money to pay for that test. So what happens in such situations? Patients go into the community taking the antibiotics and they work, they don't work, resistance is promoted, and we don't have the resources to manage that. So to summarize this, the clinical management of this disease is challenged by non-specific signs and symptoms, low diagnostic efficacy, and antimicrobial resistance. What is then needed? We need a diagnostics with a very high sensitivity, optimally above 90% and 95%. It should be able to be applicable at the lowest level of the healthcare service and be low cost. Why haven't we solved this yet? Because the concentration of the bacteria in blood is very low, and molecular diagnosis require equipment, electricity, and it can be expensive. So what is my proposal? Surprisingly, I am proposing a molecular method for diagnosing this disease. So what we want to do is use an enzyme called CRISPR-Cas12, which has the ability to detect specific segments of DNA to identify this disease. What this enzyme does is once it identifies a unique region of the bacteria DNA, it gets activated and it cleaves the bacteria DNA. While it's activated, it also cleaves any other single-stranded DNA in the mix. How do we utilize this for our diagnostic? So what we are doing currently is we are extracting DNA from the bacteria. Also, we extract the DNA from bacteria using a blood sample of an infected patient, and we pair that with an amplification procedure, which gives us more copies of the bacteria DNA. And then our Cas enzyme can detect that DNA, and in the mix with our Cas enzyme, we include single-stranded DNAs with reporters. So what happens is once it identifies the target DNA, it cleaves the target DNA, and once it's activated, it cleaves our reporters, and we get a fluorescence. Now, as complex as that sounds, we do have a plan to integrate this into a device that can be simple and easy to use in these settings. And so the workflow of that is, first of all, finding an amplification technique that doesn't require electricity, is sensitive, reproducible in these areas, and integrating that with a Cas12 enzyme that is very sensitive to that DNA, because we do need high sensitivity for this diagnostic. And then we move on to characterizing that assay with bacteria and also detection of antimicrobial resistance genes. And hopefully we can integrate this into a microfluidic device that will enable easy diagnosis of the disease. So what is our vision? Our vision is to produce a diagnostic that can deliver high efficiency and efficacy, offer comprehensive diagnosis, so we can detect the disease and antimicrobial resistant genes associated with the disease, can be cost effective and reproducible in these settings, and it's adaptable to other diseases, and can allow us to track resistance so that we can easily manage the disease in the future. Thank you.
So much, really important. Thanks, and now we have Ya.
Hello everyone, my name is Yao, and the topic for my presentation today is electric field guided regeneration of the spinal cord. So electric field regeneration spinal cord. The summary of my presentation is we are trying to use electric field to induce neural regeneration of the spinal cord. So a brief background. So the spinal cord is a tubular structure that extends from the base of the skull to the lower back. And when there is injury to the spinal cord, it disrupts the transmission of neural signal, i.e. information from the brain to the external, to the body, and vice versa. And according to the clinical features really is dependent on the location of the injury and the extent of the injury. And according to the World Health Organization, the incidence of spinal cord injury is about 500,000 a year. It really is a debilitating condition. I mean, in-hospital mortality is up to 20%. You know, those who survive, mortality rate in the first year is about 37%. It's very expensive to treat. You know, in the US, upwards of $2 million per person to treat this condition, so on and so forth. And despite significant advancements, there's still no definite treatment for spinal cord injury. At present, there is no cure for spinal cord injury. So in this context, something must be done. One of the promising interventions for neural regeneration is using electric field. And let's backtrack a little. We know that electric field actually exists naturally in the body, and it's implicated in various cellular processes like embryogenesis, neurogenesis, wound healing, and so on and so forth. So information like this, led researchers to the curiosity of what would happen if they applied external or exogenous electric field to the neurons. And we do know now from extensive research that external or exogenous electric field does provide the crucial elements for neuronal regeneration. And this is a very important point. The neuronal regeneration is biased towards the negative electrode or the cathode. And so I'll demonstrate that with a brief animation. And so assuming this is a picture of the spinal cord, this is a lesion epicenter. We have our electrodes. This is how electrodes look like. We place it on top or epidurally on the spinal cord. And let's let this represent the positive electrode or anode, and this represent the negative electrode. Let's let this represent the neurons. Now, what will happen? Assuming we start stimulation, the neurons that are facing the cathode or the negative electrode will go towards the negative electrode, and the neurons that are facing the positive electrodes will regress. Okay, so this is an enigma. So, but thankfully, this has been resolved with knowledge that the growth towards the cathode outpaces the retraction or regression that occurs at the anode. And so, if we can oscillate the electric field or change the polarity of the electric field, then we can achieve bilateral growth and synapse of the neurons, which is what is required for ideal sensory motor recovery following spinal cord injury. So this picture demonstrates what I just talked about, and so that is the concept of oscillating electric field stimulation. So that's the whole principle that my work has been based on. This picture D tries to envision how the system will look like. Now, in real world, our electrodes actually look something like this, not as fancy as the picture shows. And this is a scanning image microscopy of the electrode. Now, this is a simulation work that we did that ultimately just showed that we can produce electric field at safe enough voltage by leveraging conductive polymers. Now, I just use a jargon, conductive polymer. For now, let's just assume that the black bit that we use here, the P.PS, is a conductive polymer, and it really is key to our innovation. It's the reason why others who have tried to leverage electric field for neural regeneration have achieved suboptimal clinical outcome, because it's really not just about applying electric field, but you should be able to sustain the voltage at a level that is not damaging to the electrode and the cells. And so this is an electrochemical characterization test that we did, and we're very happy when we saw this picture. Essentially, what all it's saying is that we can produce electric field and sustain the voltage at a safe enough voltage. What we've also noticed is that actually the electrochemical performance of the electrode scales with increasing thickness of the conductive polymer. Remember, the conductive polymer is just the black bit that I showed earlier on. Now, these are surgical images. I understand that not everyone will be comfortable, so I'll talk through them first. So ideally, we just want to, the idea of these surgical images is to check the physical stability of the test, of the electrode. So we implanted the electrodes in rodent and dog, and if it informed the design of the electrodes, and also it gave an idea of the physical stability of the electrodes. So I'll quickly skip through the images, and apologies in advance, it's quite gory. So this is the rodent image, and sorry, lots of pictures, so lots of, and there's quite a lot of pictures, but the whole idea of these graphs is just to show that our electrode is also electrochemically stable beyond what has been, demonstrated in the past with past innovations. So here we applied alternating current and direct current to evaluate the electrochemical stability. And so now that we have a fair idea of the physical stability and electrochemical stability of the electrode, it's now time to check, gives a fair idea of the efficacy of the safety and efficacy of the device. We have a fair idea that our device should be somewhat stable and efficacious. So this is where we are now, trying to apply the stimulation, electric field stimulation, to in vitro spinal cord injury models to test how things will work. Whether that holds to be true, we will answer that very soon in the future. This is how we envision, this is a picture I came up with just to envision how the whole system should work, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Both of you are doing such important work. So we have a couple minutes for questions. Yes?
Hi, my name is Umi. That was a fantastic talk. I have a question for Mujer. Is that, yeah. So you did mention that you're working on this CRISPR-based technology for diagnosis, and whilst you were in your country, you were using culture-based methods in the hospitals. And I was wondering, would this CRISPR-based method, if it works, are you expecting it to be much cheaper than the culture-based methods? Because you did mention that cost is one of the reasons why a lot of cases get undiagnosed. Yeah.
And we'll take one more question, if you can just wait and then answer together. Yeah?
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Ansong. Forgive my ignorance, but I'm wondering, from the last picture you showed, does that mean this solution will be like a gadget that the person will always wear, or they will wear for some time and then they can leave it alone? Like, what shape and form would it take? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So would you like to answer, and then?
Okay. So when I worked in my country, most facilities didn't have like the materials to perform culture-based diagnosis. So most of the diagnoses were mostly serological. That is based to find antibodies against the disease. So the problem with that is those antibodies can be produced in response to other infections. And so sometimes we're not sure if it's actually the disease that is present. So with the CRISPR-based diagnosis, we hope to make it as cheap as possible. But for now, our focus is in making it as sensitive and specific as we can make it. And then in the long term, we can look at alternatives to make it as cheap as possible. Just to add, key to our whole design process is making this reproducible in African countries or in low resource settings. So that's a very key part of our project.
So that's a very good question. So the idea is that it's going to be a class 3 medical device. It is going to be an implantable device that we place epidurally, in other words, on top of the dura, which is just a covering on the spinal cord, following spinal cord injury. Now, we do know that during spinal cord injury, as part of the treatment modalities currently, surgery is being performed anyways to decompress the spinal cord. So during that surgery that is done, the device will be placed on top of the spinal cord to start the stimulation. Now, the duration of the stimulation is a question that must be answered. I don't have an answer to that now. We know, based on other previous research, that they've applied the stimulation for a total of 6 weeks. But they achieved, although they achieved some promising results, the results were somehow, suboptimal. Okay, given that we've improved the architecture or the design of our device, we don't know whether that will shorten the duration of the therapy. So this is something that we would actually, the duration is something that we will all discover, on the field.
Thanks. Now, I think we have run out of time. So first of all, apologies to all the speakers in the session. I think all of these conversations could have gone on and on and on. Really brilliant work. And so a big round of applause to everyone.